Chapter 42. The Fight in the Doorway. It seemed to Stoutenburg that from the back of the hut there came the sound of bustle and activity. He thought that mayhap Beresteyn had had the good idea of making the sledge ready for departure. And he called out loudly to his friend. It was a mocking voice, however, that rose in response. "Was your magnificence perchance looking for me?" Out of the mist which still hung round the small building Diogenes' tall figure suddenly loomed before the Lord of Stoutenburg. He was standing in the doorway of the hut, with his back to it. One hand, the right one, was thrust inside his doublet, the left was on the hilt of his sword. His battered hat was tilted rakishly above his brow and he was regarding his approaching enemy with a look of keen amusement and of scorn. At first Stoutenburg thought that his fevered fancy was playing his eyes a weird and elusive trick. Then as the reality of what he saw fully burst upon his senses he uttered a loud and hoarse cry like a savage beast that has been wounded. "Plepshurk! Smearlap!" he cried fiercely. "Rogue! Villain! Menial! Varlet! And all that you care to name me, my lord," quoth the philosopher lightly, "and entirely at your service." "Jan!" cried Stoutenburg, "Jan! In the name of hell, where are you?" "Not very far, my lord," rejoined the other. Jan is a brave soldier, but he was no match for 3 philosophers, even though one of them at first was trussed like a fowl. Jan stuck to his post. "My lord, remember that," he added more seriously, "even when all your other followers and friends were scattered to the winds like a crowd of mice at the approach of a cat. We did not hurt Jan because he is a brave soldier, but we tied him down lest he ran to get assistance whilst assistance was still available." "You insolent knave!" "You speak rightly, my lord, I am an insolent knave. And do so rejoice in mine insolence that I stayed behind here, while my brother philosophers accomplished the task which I have put upon them, on purpose to exercise some of that insolence upon you. And to see what power a man hath to curb his temper and to look pleasant, whilst an insolent knave doth tell him to his face that he is an abject and degraded cur. Then by heaven, you abominable plepshurk," cried Stoutenburg white with passion, "since you stayed here to parley with me, I can still give you so complete a retort that your final insolence will have to be spoken in hell. But let me pass now. I have business inside the hut." "I know you have, my lord," rejoined Diogenes coolly. "But I am afraid that your business will have to wait until 2 philosophers named respectively Pythagoras and Socrates have had time to finish theirs." "What do you mean?" "Let me pass, I tell you, or the wrath of your magnificence will once more be upon mine unworthy head. Donderstein! What have I not suffered already from that all-powerful wrath? You should have been hanged ere this. It is an omission, my lord, which I fear me we must now leave to the future to rectify." "Stand aside, man," cried Stoutenburg, who was hoarse with passion. "No. Not just yet," was the other's calm reply. "Stand aside," reiterated Stoutenburg wildly. He drew his sword and made a quick thrust at his enemy. He remembered the man's wounded shoulder and saw that his right hand was temporarily disabled. "Ah, my lord," quoth Diogenes lightly, as with his left he drew Bucephalus out of its scabbard. "You had forgotten, or perhaps you never knew, that during your followers' scramble for safety my sword remained unheeded in an easily accessible spot. And also that it is as much at home in my left hand as in my right." Like a bull goaded to fury, Stoutenburg made a second and more vigorous thrust at his opponent. But Diogenes was already on guard, calm, very quiet in his movements in the manner of the perfect swordsman. Stoutenburg, hot with rage, impetuous and clumsy, was at once at a disadvantage whilst this foreign adventurer, entirely self-possessed and good-humored, had the art of the sword at his fingertips, the art of perfect self-control, the art of not rushing to the attack, the supreme art of waiting for an opportunity. No feint or thrust at first, only on guard, quietly on guard. And Bucephalus seemed to be infinitely multiplied at times, so quickly did the bright steel flash out in the grey light and then subside again. Stoutenburg was at once conscious of his own disadvantage. He was no match for this brilliant sword play. His opponent did indeed appear to be only playing with him, but Stoutenburg felt all the time that the abominable knave might disarm him at any moment if he were so minded. Nor could he see very clearly. The passionate blood in him had rushed to his head and was beating furiously in his temples. Whilst the other man, with the additional advantage of a good position against the wall, kept up a perfect fusillade of good-humored comments. "Well attacked, my lord," he cried gaily, "Dondersteen. Were I as fat as your magnificence supposes, your sword would ere now have made a hole in my side. Pity I am not broader, is it not? Or more in the way of your sword. There," he added as with a quick and sudden turn of the wrist he knocked his opponent's weapon out of his hand, "allow me to return you this most useful sword." He had already stooped and picked up Stoutenburg's sword, and now was holding it with slender finger-tips by the point of its blade, and smiling, urbane and mocking, he held it out at arm's length, bowing the while with courtly, ironical grace. "Shall we call Jan, my lord," he said airily, "or one of your friends to aid you? Some of them I noticed just now seemed somewhat in a hurry to quit this hospitable molens, but mayhap one or two are still lingering behind." Stoutenburg, blind with rage, had snatched his sword back out of the scoffer's hand. He knew that the man was only playing with him, only keeping him busy here to prevent his going to Gilda. This thought threw him into a frenzy of excitement, and not heeding the other's jeers he cried out at the top of his voice. "Jan! Jan! Nicolaes! What ho!" And the other man, putting his hand up to his mouth, also shouted lustily. "Jan! Nicolaes! What ho!" Had Stoutenburg been less blind and deaf to aught save to his own hatred and his own fury, he would have heard not many paces away, the sound of horses' hoofs upon the hard ground, the champing of bits, the jingle of harness. But of this he did not think, not just yet. His thoughts were only of Gilda, and that man was holding the door of the hut because he meant to dispute with him the possession of Gilda. He cast aside all sense of pride and shame. He was no match with a foreign mercenary, whose profession was that of arms. There was no disgrace in his want of skill. But he would not yield the ground to this adventurer who meant to snatch Gilda away from him. After all, the man had a wounded shoulder and a lacerated hip. With the aid of Jan and of Nicolaes he could soon be rendered helpless. New hope rose in the Lord of Stoutenburg's heart, giving vigor to his arm. Now he heard the sound of running footsteps behind him. Jan was coming to his aid, and there were others, Nicolaes no doubt and Heemskerk. "My lord! My lord!" cried Jan, horrified at what he saw. He had heard the clang of steel against steel and had caught up the first sword that came to his hand. His calls and those of Stoutenburg as well as the more lusty ones of Diogenes reached the ears of Beresteyn, who with his friend Heemskerk was making a final survey of the molens, to search for compromising papers that might have been left about. They too heard the cries and the clash of steel. They ran down the steps of the molens, only to meet Jan, who was hurrying toward the hut with all his might. "I think my lord is being attacked," shouted Jan as he flew past, "and the Jongejuffrouw is still in the hut." These last words dissipated Nicolaes Beresteyn's sudden thoughts of cowardice. He too snatched up a sword, and followed by Heemskerk he ran in Jan's wake. The stranger, so lately a prisoner condemned to hang, was in the doorway of the hut, with his back to it, his sword in his left hand, keeping my lord of Stoutenburg at arm's length. Jan, Nicolaes and Heemskerk were on him in a trice. "2, 3, how many of you?" queried Diogenes with a laugh, as with smart riposte he met the three blades which suddenly flashed out against him. "Ah, Mynheer Beresteyn, my good Jan, I little thought that I would see you again." "Let me pass, man," cried Beresteyn, "I must to my sister." "Not yet, friend," he replied, "till I know what your intentions are." For one instant Beresteyn appeared to hesitate. The kindly sentiment which had prompted him a while ago to speak sympathetic words to a condemned man who had taken so much guilt upon his shoulders, still fought in his heart against his hatred for the man himself. Since that tragic moment at the foot of the gallows which had softened his mood, Beresteyn had learnt that it was this man who had betrayed him and his friends to the stadtholder. And guessed that it was Gilda who had instigated or bribed him into that betrayal. And now the present position seemed to bring vividly before his mind the picture of that afternoon in the Lame Cow at Haarlem. When the knave whom he had paid to keep Gilda safely out of the way was bargaining with his father to bring her back to him. All the hatred of the past few days, momentarily lulled in the face of a tragedy, rose up once more with renewed intensity in his heart. Here was the man who had betrayed him, and who, triumphant, was about to take Gilda back to Haarlem and receive a fortune for his reward. While Heemskerk, doubtful and hesitating, marvelled if 'twere wise to take up Stoutenburg's private quarrels rather than follow his other friends to Scheveningen where safety lay. Jan and Beresteyn, vigorously aided by Stoutenburg, made a concerted attack upon the knave. But it seemed as easy for Bucephalus to deal with 3 blades as with one. Now it appeared to have 3 tongues of pale grey flame that flashed hither and thither, backwards, forwards, left, right, above, below, parry, riposte, an occasional thrust, and always quietly on guard. Diogenes was in his greatest humour, laughing and shouting with glee. To anyone less blind with excitement than were these men it would soon have been clear that he was shouting for the sole purpose of making a noise louder than the hammerings, the jinglings, the knocking that was going on at the back of the hut. To right and left of the front of the small building a high wooden paling ran for a distance of 100 paces or so, enclosing a rough yard with a shed in the rear. It was impossible to see over the palings what was going on behind them, and so loudly did the philosopher shout and laugh. And so vigorously did steel strike against steel that it was equally impossible to perceive the sounds that came from there. But suddenly Stoutenburg was on the alert. Something had caught his ear, a sound that rose above the din that was going on in the doorway, a woman's piercing shriek. Even the clang of steel could not drown it, nor the lusty shouts of the fighting philosopher. For a second he strained his ear to listen. It seemed as if invisible hands were suddenly tearing down the wooden palisade that hid the rear of the small building from his view. Before his mental vision a whole picture rose to sight. A window at the back of the hut broken in, Gilda carried away by the friends of this accursed adventurer. Jan had said that 2 came to his aid at the foot of the gallows, Maria screaming. The sledge in wait, the horses ready to start. "My God, I had not thought of that," he cried. "Jan. Nicolaes. In heaven's name. Gilda. After me. Quick." And then he starts to run, skirting the palisade in the direction whence come now quite distinctly that ceaseless rattle. That jingle and stamping of the ground which proclaims the presence of horses on the point of departure. "Jan, in heaven's name, follow me," cries Stoutenburg, pausing one instant ere he rounds the corner of the palisade. "Nicolaes, leave that abominable knave. Gilda, I tell you. Gilda. They are carrying her away." Jan already has obeyed. Grasping his sword he does not pause to think. My lord has called, and 'tis my lord whom he follows. He runs after Stoutenburg as fast as his tired limbs will allow. Heemskerk, forgetting his own fears in the excitement of this hand-to-hand combat, follows in their wake. Nicolaes, too, at Stoutenburg's call, is ready to follow him. He turns to run when a grasp of iron falls upon his arm, holding it like a vice. He could have screamed with the pain, and the sword which he held falls out of his nerveless fingers. The next moment he feels himself dragged by that same iron grasp through the open door into the hut, and hears the door slammed to and locked behind him. "Your pardon if I have been rough, Mynheer," said Diogenes' pleasant voice. "But there was no time to argue outside that door, and you seemed in such a mighty hurry to run straight into that yawning abyss of disgrace." The grasp upon his arm had not relaxed, but it no longer hurt. Yet it was so firm and so absolute that Nicolaes felt powerless to wrench himself away. "Let me go," he cried hoarsely. "Not just yet, Mynheer," rejoined Diogenes coolly, "not while this hot temper is upon you. Let the Lord of Stoutenburg and our friend Jan fight to their heart's content with a fat philosopher who is well able to hold his own against them, while the other who is lean and a moderately good coachman sees that a pair of horses do not rear and bolt during the fray. Let me go, man, I tell you, cried Beresteyn, who was making frantic efforts to free himself from that slender white grapnel which held his arm as in a vice. One moment longer, Mynheer, and you shall go. The horses of which I speak are harnessed to a sledge wherein is the jongejuffrouw your sister. Yes. Verdomd kerel. Let me get to her or. As soon as the fat philosopher has disposed of the Lord of Stoutenburg and of Jan, he too will jump into the sledge and a minute later will be speeding on its way to Haarlem. And there will be 3 of us left here to hang you to that same gallows on which you should have dangled an hour ago, exclaimed Beresteyn savagely. Possibly, retorted Diogenes dryly, but even so your sister will be on the way to Haarlem rather than to exile, whither the Lord of Stoutenburg and you, her brother, would drag her. And what is it to you, you abominable plepshurk, whither I go with my sister and my friend? Only this, Mynheer, that yesterday in this very room I proclaimed myself a forger, a liar and a thief before the jongejuffrouw in order that her love for her only brother should not receive a mortal wound. At that moment I did not greatly care for that lie, he added with his wonted flippancy, but time hath lent it enchantment. It is on the whole one of the finest lies I ever told in my life. Moreover it carried conviction, the jongejuffrouw was deceived. Now I will not see that pet lie of mine made fruitless by the abominable action which you have in contemplation. Beresteyn made no immediate reply. Easily swayed as he always was by a character stronger than his own, the word spoken by the man whom he had always affected to despise, could not fail to move him. He knew that that same abominable action of which he was being accused had indeed been contemplated not only by Stoutenburg but also by himself. It had only required one word from Stoutenburg, Gilda of course comes with us, one hint that her presence in Holland would be a perpetual menace to his personal safety. And he had been not only willing but fully prepared to put this final outrage upon the woman whom he should have protected with his life. Therefore now he dared not meet the eager, questioning glance of this adventurer, in whose merry eyes the look of irrepressible laughter was momentarily veiled by one of anxiety. He looked around him restlessly, shiftily. His wandering glance fell on the narrow inner door which stood open, and he caught a glimpse of a smaller room beyond, with a window at the further end of it. That window had been broken in from without, the narrow frame torn out of its socket and the mullion wrenched out of its groove. Through the wide breach thus made in the lath and mud walls of the hut, Beresteyn suddenly saw the horses and the sledge out there in the open. The fight of a while ago by the front door had now been transferred to this spot. A short fat man with his back to the rear of the sledge was holding the Lord Stoutenburg and Heemskerk at a couple of arms' lengths with the point of his sword. Jan was apparently not yet on the scene. Another man, lean and tall, was on the box of the sledge, trying with all his might to hold a pair of horses in, who frightened by the clang of steel against steel, by the movement and the shouting, were threatening to plunge and rear at any moment. Diogenes laughed aloud. My friend Pythagoras seems somewhat hard-pressed, he said, and those horses might complicate the situation at any moment. I must to them now, Mynheer. Tell me then quickly which you mean to do, behave like an honest man or like a cur? What right have you to dictate to me, said Beresteyn sullenly. I have no account to give to you of mine own actions. None I admit, rejoined the philosopher placidly, but let me put the situation a little more clearly before you. On the one hand you must own that I could at this moment with very little trouble and hardly any scruples render you physically helpless first, then lock you up in this room, and go and join my friends outside. On the other hand you could leave this room sound in body and at heart an honest man. Jump into the sledge beside your sister and convey her yourself safely back to the home from whence you, her own brother, should never have allowed her to be taken. I cannot do it, retorted Beresteyn moodily. I could not meet my father face to face after what has happened. Think you Gilda would tell him that his only son has played the part of traitor? She loathes and despises me. She has a horror of that treacherous plot. But the plot has come to naught. And she will consider that you are punished enough for it already, and feel happy that you are free from Stoutenburg's clutches. I cannot leave Stoutenburg now, and she must go with him. She hates me for the outrage which was committed against her. She does not know your share in it, said Diogenes quickly. Have I not told you that I lied admirably? She believes me to be the only culprit and to have forged your name to hide mine own infamy. A hot flush rose to Berestine's pale cheeks. I cannot bear to profit by your generosity, he said dully. Pshaw, man, rejoined the other not without a tone of bitterness, what matters what my reputation is in her sight? She despises me so utterly already that a few sins more or less cannot lower me further in her sight. No. No. I cannot do it, persisted Berestine. Go to your friends, man, he added fiercely, the fat one is getting sorely pressed, the other cannot cope with the horses much longer. Go to their aid. And kill me if you are so minded. Indeed I no longer care, and in any case I could not survive all this shame. Die by all means when and where you list, said Diogenes placidly, but 'tis your place first of all to take your sister now under your own protection. To keep her in the knowledge that whatever sins you may have committed you were at least true and loyal to herself. By heaven, man, hath she not suffered enough already in her person, in her pride, above all in her affections? Your loyalty to her at this moment would be ample compensation for all that she hath suffered. Be an honest man and take her to her home. How can I? I have no home, and she is a menace to us all. I am a menace to you, you weak-hearted craven, cried Diogenes, whose mustache bristled with fury now. For by heaven I swear that you shall not leave this place with a whole skin save to do an honest man's act of reparation. And as if to give greater emphasis to his words, Diogenes gave the other man's arm a vigorous wrench which caused Berestine to groan and curse with pain. I may have to hurt you worse than this presently, said the philosopher imperturbably as he dragged Berestine, who by now felt dizzy and helpless, to the nearest chair and deposited him there. Were you not her brother, I believe I should crack your obstinate skull. As it is, I will leave you here to take counsel with reason and honesty until I have finally disposed of my Lord of Stoutenburg. He ran quickly to the outer door, pushed the bolts home, gave the key an extra turn and then pulled it out of the lock and threw it out of the window. Berestine, somewhat stunned with emotion, a little faint with that vigorous wrench on his arm, and prostrate with the fatigue and excitement of the past 2 days, made no attempt to stop him. No doubt he realized that any such attempt would indeed be useless. There was so much vitality, so much strength in the man that his tall stature appeared to Nicolaes now of giant-like proportions. And his powers to savor of the supernatural. He watched him with dull, tired eyes, as he finally went out of the room through the inner door, no doubt that this too he locked behind him. Berestine did not know. He half lay, half sat in the chair like a log, the sound of the fight outside, of the shouts that greeted Diogenes' arrival, of the latter's merry laughter that went echoing through the mist, only reached his dull perceptions like a far-off dream. But in his mind he saw it all. The walls of the hut were transparent before his mental vision. He saw now the unequal fight. A perfect swordsman against Stoutenburg's unreasoning attacks and Heemskerk's want of skill. Jan too will have joined them by now, but he was loutish and clumsy. The issue would have been a foregone conclusion even without the aid of the fat knave who had held his own already for nearly 10 minutes. Yet, though his thoughts were not by any means all clear upon the subject, Berestine made no attempt to go to his own friend's assistance. Vaguely some pleasing visions began to float through space around him. It seemed as if the magic personality of a nameless adventurer still filled this narrow room with its vitality, with its joy and with its laughter. The optimistic breeziness which emanated from the man himself had lingered here after he was gone. His cheerful words still hung and reverberated upon the cold, wintry air. After all, why not? Mused Berestine. Gilda knew of his share in the conspiracy against the stadtholder, of course. But that conspiracy had now aborted. Gilda would never betray her brother's share in it either to the stadtholder's vengeance or to her father's wrath. And she had been made to believe that he was not the mover in the outrage against her person. Then, why not? She had been forcibly dragged out of this hut. She knew that Stoutenburg meant to take her away with him into exile. Even if she had been only partially conscious since she was taken to the sledge, she would know that a desperate fight had been going on around her. Then if he, Nicolaes, now appeared upon the scene, if he took charge of her and of the sledge, and with the help of one or other of those knaves outside sped away with her north to Haarlem, would she not be confirmed in her belief in his loyalty? Would he not play a heroic role, make her happy and himself free? Then, why not? All the papers relating to the aborted conspiracy which might have compromised him he had upon his person even now. He and Heemskerk had themselves collected them in the weighing room of the molens after Lucas of Sparendam had brought his terrible news. Then, why not? He rose briskly from his chair. The outer door of the hut was locked. He crossed to the inner door. That was just on the latch and he threw it open. Before him now was the broken window frame through which peeped the dull grey light of this misty winter's morning. Out in the open through the filmy veil of the fog he could see the final phases of an unequal fight. Stoutenburg and Heemskerk were both disarmed and Jan had just appeared upon the scene. More far-seeing than were the Lord of Stoutenburg and Mynheer Heemskerk, he had very quickly realized that sword in hand no one was a match for this foreigner and his invincible blade. When the fighting was transferred from the doorway of the hut to the open roadway in the rear, he had at first followed in the wake of his chief, then he had doubled back. Swiftly running to the molens, and in the basement from out the scattered litter of arms hastily thrown down, he had quickly picked up a couple of pistols, found some ammunition, quietly loaded the weapons and with them in his hand started to run back to the hut. All this had taken some few minutes while Pythagoras had borne the brunt of a vigorous attack from the Lord of Stoutenburg and Mynheer Heemskerk, whilst Diogenes parleyed with Beresteyn inside the hut. Beresteyn saw the whole picture before him. He had thrown open the door, and looked through the broken window at the precise moment when the Lord of Stoutenburg's sword flew out of his hand. Then it was that Jan came running along, shouting to my lord. Stoutenburg turned quickly, saw his faithful lieutenant and caught sight of the pistols which he held. The next second he had snatched one out of Jan's hand. And the pale ray of a wintry sun penetrating through the mist found its reflection in a couple of steel barrels pointed straight at a laughing philosopher. Beresteyn from within felt indeed as if his heart stood still for that one brief, palpitating second. Was fate after all taking the decision for the future, Gilda's and his, out of his hands into her own? Would a bullet end that vigorous life and still that merry laugh and that biting tongue forever? And leave Nicolaes to be swayed once more by the dark schemes and arbitrary will of his friend Stoutenburg? Fate was ready, calmly spinning the threads of human destinies. But there are some men in the world who have the power and the skill to take their destinies in their own hands. The philosopher and weaver of dreams, the merry Laughing Cavalier was one of these. What the Lord of Stoutenburg had seen that he perceived equally quickly. He, too, had caught sight of Jan, and of the two steel barrels simultaneously leveled at him. He too realized that the most skilled swordsman is but a sorry match against a pair of bullets. But while Beresteyn held his breath and Stoutenburg tried to steady the trembling of his hand, he raised Bucephalus above his head and with a wild shout pointed toward the southern horizon far away. "The Stadtholder's guard," he cried lustily, "they are on us. Sauve caput." Three cries of mad terror rent the air, there was a double detonation, a great deal of smoke. The horses in the sledge reared and plunged wildly, forcing those who were nearest to the vehicle to beat a precipitate retreat. "At the horses' heads, you wooden-headed bladder," shouted Diogenes lustily. Pythagoras did his best to obey, while Socrates was nearly dragged off the box by the frightened horses. Heemskerk had already incontinently taken to his heels. Jan had dropped his weapon which Diogenes at once picked up. The Lord of Stoutenburg was preparing to fire again. sauve caput, my lord!" cried Diogenes, "before I change my mind and put a hole through your heel, which will prevent your running away fast enough to escape the stadtholder's wrath." There was another detonation. The horses reared and plunged again. When Beresteyn once more obtained a clear view of the picture, he saw the Lord of Stoutenburg stretched out on his back upon the ground in a position that was anything but dignified and certainly very perilous. For Diogenes towering above him was holding him by both feet. The tall soldierly figure of the foreigner stood out clearly silhouetted against the grey, misty light. His head with its wealth of unruly brown curls was thrown back with a gesture that almost suggested boyish delight in some impish mischief, whilst his infectious laugh echoed and re-echoed against the walls of the molens and of the hut. Jan was on his hands and knees crawling toward those two men, the conqueror and the conquered, with no doubt a vague idea that he might even now render assistance to my lord. "Here, Pythagoras, old fat head," cried Diogenes gaily, "see that our friend here does not interfere with me, and that he hath not a concealed poniard somewhere about his person. Then collect all pistols and swords that are lying about, well out of harm's way. In the meanwhile what am I to do with his magnificence? He is kicking like a vicious colt and that shoulder of mine is beginning to sting like fury. Kill me, man, kill me!" cried Stoutenburg savagely. "Curse you, why don't you end this farce?" "Because, my lord," said Diogenes more seriously than was his wont, "the purest and most exquisite woman on God's earth did once deign to bestow the priceless jewel of her love upon you. Did she know of your present plight, she would even now be pleading for you. Therefore," he added more flippantly, "I am going to give myself the satisfaction of making you a present of the last miserable shred of existence which you will drag on from this hour forth in wretchedness and exile to the end of your days. Take your life and freedom, my lord," he continued in response to the invectives which Stoutenburg muttered savagely under his breath. "Take it at the hands of the miserable plepshurk whom you so despise. It is better methinks to do this rather than fall into the hands of the stadtholder, whose mercy for a fallen enemy would be equal to your own." Then he shouted to Pythagoras, "Here, old compeer. Search his magnificence for concealed weapons, and then make ready to go. We have wasted too much time already." Despite Stoutenburg's struggles and curses, Pythagoras obeyed his brother philosopher to the letter. His lordship and Jan were both effectually disarmed now. Then only did Diogenes allow Stoutenburg to struggle to his feet. He had his sword in his left hand and Pythagoras stood beside him. Jan found his master's hat and cloak and helped him on with them, and then he said quietly, "The minutes are precious, my lord. 'Tis a brief run to Rwswyk, my lord of Heemskerk has gone and Mynheer Beresteyn has disappeared. Here we can do nothing more." "Nothing, my good Jan," said Diogenes more seriously, "you are a brave soldier and a faithful servant. Take his magnificence away to safety. You have well deserved your own." Stoutenburg gave a last cry of rage and of despair. For a moment it seemed as if his blind fury would still conquer reason and prudence and that he meant once more to make an attack upon his victorious enemy. But something in the latter's look of almost insolent triumph recalled him to the peril of his own situation. He passed his hand once or twice over his brow, like a man who is dazed and only just returning to consciousness, then he called loudly to Jan to follow him, and walked rapidly away northwards through the fog. Beresteyn went up to the broken window and watched him till he was out of sight, then he looked on Diogenes. That philosopher also watched the retreating figure of the Lord of Stoutenburg until the fog swallowed it up, then he turned to his friend. "Pythagoras, old compeer," he said with a shrug of his broad shoulders, "what would you take to be walking at this moment in that man's shoes?" "I wouldn't do it, friend," rejoined Pythagoras placidly, "for the possession of a running river of home-brewed ale. And I am mightily dry at the present moment. Jump up then on the box beside Socrates, you old wine-tub, and get to Leyden as quickly as these horses will take you. A halt at Voorburg will refresh you all." "But you?" queried Socrates from his post of vantage. I shall make my way to Rwswyk first and get a horse there. I shall follow you at a distance, and probably overtake you before you get to Leyden. But you will not see me after this, unless there is trouble, which is not likely. But the Jongejuffrouw, persisted Socrates. Hush. I shall never really lose sight of you and the sledge. But you must serve her as best you can. Someone will be with her who will know how to take care of her. Who? Her own brother, of course, Meneer Beresteyn. Over the sill, Meneer. He now shouted, calling to Nicolaes, who still stood undecided, shamed, hesitating in the broken framework of the window. Over the sill, 'tis only 3 feet from the ground. And horses and men are quite ready for you. He gave a lusty cheer of satisfaction as Beresteyn, throwing all final cowardly hesitations to the wind, suddenly made up his mind to take the one wise and prudent course. He swung himself through the window, and in a few moments was standing by Diogenes' side. Let me at least tell you, sir, he began earnestly. Hush. Tell me nothing now, broke in the other man quickly, the Jongejuffrouw might hear. But I must thank you. If you say another word, said Diogenes, sinking his voice to a whisper, I'll order Socrates to drive on and leave you standing here. But into the sledge, man, in heaven's name. The Jongejuffrouw is unconscious, her woman daft with fear. When the lady regains consciousness, let her brother's face be the first sight to comfort her. Into the sledge, man, he added impatiently, or by heaven I'll give the order to start. And without more ado, he hustled Nicolaes into the sledge. The latter, bewildered, really not clear with himself as to what he ought to do, peeped tentatively beneath the cover of the vehicle. He saw his sister lying there prone upon the wooden floor of the sledge, her head rested against a bundle of rugs hastily put together for her comfort. Maria was squatting beside her, her head and ears muffled in a cloak, her hands up to her eyes. She was moaning incoherently to herself. Gilda's eyes were closed, and her face looked very pale. Beresteyn's heart ached at the pitiful sight. She looked so wan and so forlorn that a sharp pang of remorse for all his cruelty to her shot right through his dormant sensibilities. There was just room for him under the low cover of the sledge. He hesitated no longer now. He felt indeed as if nothing would tear him away from Gilda's side until she was safely home again in their father's arms. A peremptory order, en avant, struck upon his ear, a shout from the driver to his horses, the harness rattled. The sledge creaked upon its framework and then slowly began to move. Beresteyn lifted the flap of the hood at the rear of the vehicle and looked out for the last time upon the molens and the hut, where such a tragic act in his life's drama had just been enacted. He saw Diogenes still standing there, waving his hat in farewell. For a few moments longer his splendid figure stood out clearly against the flat grey landscape beyond. Then slowly the veil of mist began to envelop him, at first only blurring the outline of his mantle or his sash, then it grew more dense and the sledge moved away more rapidly. The next moment the Laughing Cavalier had disappeared from view. Chapter 43. Leyden once more. After that Gilda had lived as in a dream, only vaguely conscious that good horses and a smoothly gliding vehicle were conveying her back to her home. Of this fact she was sure. Nicolaes was sitting quite close under the hood of the sledge, and when first she became fully aware of the reality of his presence, he had raised her hand to his lips and had said in response to a mute appeal from her eyes, "We are going home." After that a quiet sense of utter weariness pervaded her being, and she fell into a troubled sleep. She did not heed what went on around her, she only knew that once or twice during the day there was a halt for food and drink. The nearness of her brother, his gentleness toward her, gave her a sense of well-being. Even though her heart felt heavy with a great sorrow which made the whole future appear before her like an interminable vista of blank and grey dullness. It was at her suggestion that arrangements were made for an all-night halt at Leyden, which city they reached in the early part of the afternoon. She begged Nicolaes that they might put up at the hostelry of the White Goat on the further side of the town, and that from thence a messenger might be sent to her father, asking him to come and meet her there on the morrow. Though Nicolaes was not a little astonished at this suggestion of Gilda's, seeing that surely she must be longing to be home again and that Haarlem could easily have been reached before night, he did not wish to run counter to her will. True enough, he dreaded the meeting with his father, but he knew that it had to come, and felt that, whatever might be the future consequences of it all, he could not possibly bear alone the burden of remorse and of shame which assailed him every time he encountered Gilda's tear-stained eyes, and saw how wearied and listless she looked. So he called a halt at the White Goat, and as soon as he saw his sister safely installed, with everything ordered for her comfort, and a tasteful supper prepared, he sent a messenger on horseback at once to Haarlem to his father. Gilda had deliberately chosen to spend the night at the hostelry of the White Goat because she felt that in that quaint old building with its wide oak staircase, over which she had been carried 5 days ago, dizzy and half fainting, the blackened rafters would mayhap still echo with the sound of a merry laughter which she would never hear again. But when the sledge finally turned in under the low gateway and drew up in the small courtyard of the inn, when with wearied feet and shaking knees she walked up those oaken stairs, it seemed to her that the vivid memories which the whole place recalled were far harder to bear than those more intangible ones which, waking and sleeping, had tortured her up to now. The bedroom too, with the smaller one leading out of it, was the same in which she had slept. As the obsequious waiting wench threw open the door for the noble jongejuffrouw to pass through, she saw before her the wide open hearth with its crackling fire, the high-backed chair wherein she had sat, the very footstool which he had put to her feet. It seemed to her at first as if she could not enter, as if his splendid figure would suddenly emerge out of the semi-darkness to confront her with his mocking eyes and his smiling face. She seemed to see him everywhere, and she had to close her eyes to chase away that all too insistent vision. The waiting wench did not help matters either, for she asked persistently and shyly about the handsome Mynheer who had such an irresistible fund of laughter in him. Maria too, in her mutterings and grumblings, contrived, most unwittingly, since she adored Gilda, to inflict a series of tiny pinpricks on an already suffering heart. Tired in body and in mind, Gilda could not sleep that night. She was living over again every second of the past 5 days, the interview with that strangely winning person, a stranger still to her then, here in this room. How she had hated him at first. How she had tried to shame and wound him with her words, trying all the while to steel her heart against that irresistible gaiety and good humor which shone from him like a radiance. Then that second interview in Rotterdam. Did she still hate him then? And if not, when was hatred first changed into the love which now so completely filled her soul? Looking back on those days, she could not tell. All that she knew was that when he was brought before her helpless and pinioned, she already loved him. And that since that moment love had grown and strengthened until her whole heart was given to that same nameless soldier of fortune whom she had first despised. To live over again those few brief days which seemed now like an eternity was a sweet, sad pleasure which Gilda could endure. But what became intolerable in the darkness and in the silence of the night was the remembrance of the immediate past. Clearly cut out before her mental vision were the pictures of her life this morning in the hut beside the molens, and indeed, it was a lifetime that had gone by in those few hours. Firstly, Stoutenburg's visit in the early morning, his smooth words and careless chatter. She, poor fool, under the belief all the time that the treacherous plot had been abandoned, and that she would forthwith be conveyed back to her father. Her thoughts of pleading for the condemned man's life, then the tramping of feet, the cries of terror, her brother's appearance bringing the awful news of betrayal. She lived over again those moments of supreme horror when she realized how Stoutenburg had deceived her, and that Nicolaes himself was but a traitor and a miserable liar. She knew then that it was the adventurer, the penniless soldier of fortune whom she had tried to hate and to despise, who had quietly gone to warn the stadtholder. And that his action had been the direct working of God's will in a brave and loyal soul, she knew also by a mysterious intuition which no good woman has ever been able to resist. That the man who had stood before her, self-convicted and self-confessed, had accepted that humiliation to save her the pain of fearing and despising her own brother. The visions now became more dim and blurred. She remembered Stoutenburg's fury, his hideous threats of vengeance on the man who had thrown himself across his treacherous path. She remembered pleading to that monster, weeping, clinging to his arm in a passionate appeal. She remembered the soul agony which she felt when she realized that that appeal had been in vain. Then she had stood for a moment silent and alone in the hut. Stoutenburg had left her in order to accomplish that hideous act of revenge. After that she remembered nothing clearly. She could only have been half-conscious, and all round her there was a confusion of sounds. Of shouts and clash of arms. She thought that she was being lifted out of the chair into which she had fallen in a partial swoon, that she heard Maria's cries of terror. And that she felt the cold damp morning air striking upon her face. Presently she knew that Nicolaes was beside her, and that she was being taken home. All else was a blank or a dream. Now she was tossing restlessly upon the lavender-scented bed in this hostelry so full of memories. Her temples were throbbing, her eyes felt like pieces of glowing charcoal in her head. The blackness around her weighed upon her soul until she felt that she could not breathe. Outside the silence of the night was being gravely disturbed. There was the sound of horses' hoofs upon the cobblestones of the yard, the creaking of a vehicle brought to a standstill. The usual shouts for grooms and ostlers. A late arrival had filled the tranquil inn with its bustle and its noise. Then once again all was still, and Gilda turned her aching head upon the pillow. Though the room was not hot, and the atmosphere outside heavy with frost, she felt positively stifled. After a while this feeling of oppression became intolerable. She rose, and in the darkness she groped for her fur-lined cloak which she wrapped closely around her. Then she found her way across to the window and drew aside the curtain. No light penetrated through the latticed panes. The waning moon, which 4 nights ago had been at times so marvelously brilliant, had not yet risen above the horizon line. As Gilda's fingers fumbled for the window latch she heard a distant church clock strike the midnight hour. She threw open the casement. The sill was low and she leaned out, peering up and down the narrow street. It was entirely deserted and pitch dark save where on the wall opposite the light from a window immediately below her threw its feeble reflection. Vaguely she wondered who was astir in the small hostelry. No doubt it was the taproom which was there below her, still lighted up, and apparently with its small casement also thrown open, like the one out of which she was leaning. For now, when the reverberating echo of the chiming clock had entirely died away, she was conscious of a vague murmur of voices coming up from below, confused at first and undistinguishable. But presently she heard a click as if the casement had been pushed further open or mayhap a curtain pulled aside, for after that the sound of the voices became more distinct and clear. With beating heart and straining ears Gilda leaned as far out of the window as she could, listening intently. She had recognized her father's voice. And he was speaking so strangely that even as she listened she felt all the blood tingling in her veins. "My son, sir," he was saying, had, I am glad to say, sufficient pride and manhood in him not to bear the full weight of your generosity any longer. He sent a special messenger on horseback out to me this afternoon. As soon as I knew that my daughter was here I came as fast as a sleigh and the 3 best horses in my stables could bring me. I had no thought, of course, of seeing you here. I had no thought that you should see me, sir, said a voice which by its vibrating tones had the power of sending the hot blood rushing to the listener's neck and cheeks. Had I not entered the yard just as your sledge turned in under the gateway, you had not been offended by mine unworthy presence. I would in that case have searched the length and breadth of this land to find you, sir, rejoined Cornelius Beresteyn earnestly. For half an hour later my son had told me the whole circumstances of his association with you. An association of which Mynheer Nicolaes will never be overproud, I'll warrant, came in slightly less flippant accents than usual from the foreigner. Do I not stand self-confessed as a liar, a forger and abductor of helpless women? A fine record forsooth, and ere he ordered me to be hanged my lord of Stoutenburg did loudly proclaim me as such before his friends and before his followers. His friends, sir, are the sons of my friends. I will loudly proclaim you what you truly are, a brave man, a loyal soldier, a noble gentleman. Nicolaes has told me every phase of his association with you, from his shameful proposal to you in regard to his own sister, down to this moment when you still desired that Gilda and I should remain in ignorance of his guilt. What is the good, Mynheer, of raking up all this past, said the philosopher lightly. I would that Mynheer Nicolaes had known how to hold his tongue. Thank God that he did not, retorted Cornelius Beresteyn hotly. Had he done so I stood in peril of failing, for the first time in my life, in an important business obligation. Not towards me, Mynheer, at any rate. Yes, sir, towards you, affirmed Beresteyn decisively. I promised you 500,000 guilders if you brought my daughter safely back to me. I know from mine own son, sir, that I owe her safety to no one but to you. Ours was an ignoble bargain, Mynheer, said Diogenes with his wonted gaiety, and though she could not see him, Gilda could picture his face now alive with merriment and suppressed laughter. The humor of the situation appealed to me, it proved irresistible, but the bargain in no way binds you, seeing that it was I who had been impious enough to lay hands upon your daughter. At my son's suggestion, I know, rejoined Beresteyn quietly, and from your subsequent acts, sir, I must infer that you only did it because you felt that she was safer under your charge than at the mercy of her own brother and his friends. Nay. Do not protest, he added earnestly. Nicolaes, as you see, is of the same opinion. May heaven reward you, sir, for that kindly thought of me, said Diogenes more seriously. It will cheer me in the future, when I and all my doings will have faded from your ken. You are not leaving Holland, sir? Not just now, Mynheer, while there is so much fighting to be done. The stadtholder hath need of soldiers. And he will, sir, find none better than you throughout the world. And with a goodly fortune to help you. Speak not of that, Mynheer, he said firmly, I could not take your money. If I did I should never know a happy hour again. Oh! I am quite serious, sir, though indeed you might not think that I can ever be serious. For 6 days now I have had a paymaster. Mynheer Nicolaes' money has burned a hole in my good humor, it has scorched my hands, wounded my shoulder and lacerated my hip. It has brought on me all the unpleasant sensations which I have so carefully avoided hitherto, remorse, humiliation, and 1 or 2 other sensations which will never leave me until my death. It changed temporarily the shiftless, penniless soldier of fortune into a responsible human being, with obligations and duties. I had to order horses, bespeak lodgings, keep accounts. Ye gods, it made a slave of me. Keep your money, sir, it is more fit for you to handle than for me. Let me go back to my shiftlessness, my penury, my freedom, eat my fill today, starve tomorrow, and one day look up at the stars from the lowly earth. With a kindly bullet in my chest that does not mean to blunder. And if in the days to come your thoughts ever do revert to me, I pray you think of me as happy or nearly so, owning no master save my whim, bending my back to none. Keeping my hat on my head when I choose, and ending my days in a ditch or in a palace, the carver of mine own destiny, the sole arbiter of my will. And now I pray you seek that rest of which you must be sorely in need. I start at daybreak tomorrow, mayhap we shall never meet again, save in heaven, if indeed, there be room there for such a thriftless adventurer as I. But whither do you mean to go, sir? To the mountains of the moon, sir, rejoined the philosopher lightly, or along the Milky Way to the land of the might-have-been. Before we part, sir, may I shake you by the hand? There was silence down below after that. Gilda listened in vain, no further words reached her ears just then. She tiptoed as quietly as she could across the room, finding her way with difficulty in the dark. At last her fumbling fingers encountered the latch of the door of the inner room where Maria lay snoring lustily. It took Gilda some little time to wake the old woman, but at last she succeeded, and then ordered her, very peremptorily, to strike a light. "Are you ill, Mejuffrouw?" queried Maria anxiously, even though she was but half awake. "No," replied Gilda curtly, "but I want my dress, quick now," she added, for Maria showed signs of desiring to protest. The Jongejuffrouw was in one of those former imperious moods of hers when she exacted implicit obedience from her servants. Alas! The last few days had seen that mood submerged into an ocean of sorrow and humiliation. And Maria, though angered at having been wakened out of a first sleep, was very glad to see her darling looking so alert and so brisk. Indeed, the light being very dim, Maria could not see the brilliant glow that lit up the Jongejuffrouw's cheeks as with somewhat febrile gestures she put on her dress and smoothed her hair. "Now put on your dress too, Maria," she said when she was ready, "and tell my father, who is either in the taproom down below or hath already retired to his room, that I desire to speak with him." And Maria, bewildered and flustered, had no option but to obey. Chapter 44. Blake of Blakeney. While Maria completed a hasty toilet, Gilda's instinct had drawn her back once more to the open window. The light from the room below was still reflected on the opposite wall, and from the taproom the buzz of voices had not altogether ceased. Cornelius Beresteyn was speaking now. "Indeed," he said, "it will be the one consolation left to me, since you do reject my friendship, sir." "Not your friendship, sir, only your money," interposed Diogenes. "Well, you do speak of lifelong parting. But your two friends have indeed deserved well of me. Without their help no doubt you, sir, first and then my dearly loved daughter would have fallen victims to that infamous Stoutenburg. Will a present of 20,000 guilders each gratify them, do you think?" A ringing laugh roused the echoes of the sleeping hostelry. 20,000 guilders. "Ye gods!" exclaimed Diogenes merrily. "Pythagoras, dost hear, old bladder-face? Socrates, my Robin, dost realize it? 20,000 guilders each in your pockets, old compeers. Lord! How drunk you will both be tomorrow." Out of the confused hubbub that ensued Gilda could disentangle nothing definite. There was a good deal of shouting and clapping of pewter mugs against a table, and through it all that irresponsible, infectious laughter which, strangely enough, had to Gilda's ears at this moment a curious tone, almost of bitterness, as if its merriment was only forced. Then when the outburst of gaiety had somewhat subsided she once more heard her father's voice. Maria was dressed by this time, and now at a word from Gilda was ready to go downstairs and to deliver the Jongejuffrouw's message to her father. "You spoke so lightly just now, sir, of dying in a ditch or palace," Cornelius Beresteyn was saying, "but you did tell me that day in Haarlem that you had kith and kindred in England. Where is that father of whom you spoke, and your mother who is a saint? Your irresponsible vagabondage will leave her in perpetual loneliness." "My mother is dead, sir," said Diogenes quietly, "my father broke her heart. Even then he hath a right to know that his son is a brave and loyal gentleman. He will only know that when his son is dead." "That was a cruel dictum, sir. Not so cruel as that which left my mother to starve in the streets of Haarlem. Aye. 10,000 times more cruel, since your dear mother, sir, had not to bear the awful burden of lifelong remorse." "Bah!" rejoined the philosopher with a careless shrug of the shoulders, "a man seldom feels remorse for wrongs committed against a woman. But he doth for those committed against his flesh and blood, his son. I have no means of finding out, sir. If my father hath or hath not remorse for his wilful desertion of wife and child, England is a far-off country, I would not care to undertake so unprofitable a pilgrimage." "Then why not let me do so, sir?" queried Cornelius Beresteyn calmly. "You?" "Yes. Why not? Why should you trouble, Mynheer, to seek out the father of such a vagabond as I? Because I would like to give a man, an old man your father must be now, the happiness of calling you his son. You say he lives in England. I often go to England on business. Will you not at least tell me your father's name?" "I have no cause to conceal it, Mynheer," rejoined Diogenes carelessly. "In England they call him Blake of Blakeney. His home is in Sussex and I believe that it is a stately home. But I know the Squire of Blakeney well, said Cornelius Beresteyn eagerly, my bankers at Amsterdam also do business for him. I know that just now he is in Antwerp on a mission from King James of England to the Archduchess. He hath oft told Mynheer Buzeler, our mutual banker, that he was moving heaven and earth to find the son whom he had lost. Heaven and earth take a good deal of moving, quoth Diogenes lightly, once a wife and son have been forsaken and left to starve in a foreign land. Mine English father wedded my mother in the church of St. Peter at Haarlem. My friend Frans Hals, God bless him, knew my mother and cared for me after she died. He has all the papers in his charge relating to the marriage. It has long ago been arranged between us that if I die with ordinary worthiness, he will seek out my father in England and tell him that mayhap, after all, even though I have been a vagabond all my life, I have never done anything that should cause him to blush for his son. Apparently at this juncture, Maria must have knocked at the door of the tapperij, for Gilda, whose heart was beating more furiously than ever, heard presently the well-known firm footsteps of her father as he rapidly ascended the stairs. 2 minutes later Gilda lay against her father's heart, and her hand resting in his she told him from beginning to end everything that she had suffered from the moment when after watch night service in the Groot Kerk she first became aware of the murmur of voices, to that when she first realized that the man whom she should have hated, the knave whom she should have despised, filled her heart and soul to the exclusion of all other happiness in the world, and that he was about to pass out of her life forever. It took a long time to tell, for she had suffered more, felt more, lived more in the past 5 days than would fill an ordinary life, nor did she disguise anything from her father. Not even the conversation which she had had at Rotterdam in the dead of night with the man who had remained nameless until now, and in consequence of which he had gone at once to warn the stadtholder and had thus averted the hideous conspiracy which would have darkened forever the destinies of many Dutch homes. Of Nicolaes she did not speak. She knew that he had confessed his guilt to his father, who would know how to forgive in the fullness of time. When she had finished speaking her father said somewhat roughly, but for that vervloekte adventurer down there, you would never have suffered, Gilda, as you did. Nicolaes. Nicolaes, father dear, she broke in quietly, is very dear to us both. I think that his momentary weakness will endear him to us even more. But he was a tool in the hands of that unscrupulous Stoutenburg, and but for that nameless and penniless soldier whose hand you were proud to grasp just now, I would not be here in your arms at this moment. Ah, said Cornelius Beresteyn dryly, is this the way that the wind blows, my girl? Did you not know then that the rascal, the day after he dared to lay hands upon you, was back again in Haarlem bargaining with me to restore you to my arms in exchange for a fortune? And 2 days later, father dear, she retorted, he endured insults, injuries, cruelties from Stoutenburg, rather than betray Nicolaes' guilt before me. Murmured Cornelius, and there was a humorous twinkle in his eyes as he looked down upon his daughter's bowed head. And but for that same rascal, father, she continued softly, you would at this moment be mourning a dead daughter in Holland, a hideous act of treachery. Hush, my dear, cried the old man impulsively, as he put his kind protecting arms round the child whom he loved so dearly. I would never have followed the Lord of Stoutenburg while I lived, she said simply. Please God, he said earnestly, I would sooner have seen you in the crypt beside your mother. Then, father, hath not the rascal you speak of deserved well of us? Can we not guess that even originally he took me away from Haarlem, only because he knew that if he refused the bargain, proposed to him by mine own brother, Stoutenburg would have found some other means of ensuring my silence? You are a good advocate, my girl, rejoined Cornelius with a sly wink which brought the color rushing up to Gilda's cheeks. I think, by your leave, I'll go and shake that vervloekte kerel once more by the hand. And, shall I tell him that you bear him no ill will? He added roguishly. Yes, father dear, tell him that, she said gently. Then will you go to bed, dear? He asked, you are overwrought and tired. I will sit by the window quietly for a quarter of an hour, she said, after that I promise you that I will go peaceably to bed. He kissed her tenderly, for she was very dear to him, but being a man of vast understanding and profound knowledge of men and things. The humorous twinkle did not altogether fade from his eyes as he finally bade his daughter good night, and then quietly went out of the room. Chapter 45. The End. Diogenes sat beside the window in the taproom listening with half an ear to the sounds in and about the hostelry which were dying out one by one. At first there had been a footfall in the room overhead which had seemed to him the sweetest music that man could hear. It had paced somewhat restlessly up and down and to the Laughing Cavalier, the gay and irresponsible soldier of fortune. It had seemed as if every creaking of a loose board beneath the featherweight of that footfall found its echo in his heart. But anon Mynheer Cornelius Beresteyn was called away and then all was still in the room upstairs. And Diogenes burying his head in his hands evoked the picture of that room as he had seen it 5 days ago. The proud Jongvrow in her high-backed chair, looking on him with blue eyes which she vainly tried to render hard through their exquisite expression of appealing, childlike gentleness, and he groaned aloud with the misery of the inevitable which with stern finger bade him go and leave behind him all the illusions, all the dreams which he had dared to weave. Had she not told him that she despised him, that his existence was as naught to her, that she looked on him as a menial and a knave, somewhat below the faithful henchmen who were in her father's service? Ye gods! He had endured much in his life of privations, of physical and mental pain, but was there aught on earth or in the outermost pits of hell to be compared with the agony of this ending to a dream? The serving wench came in just then. She scarcely dared approach the Mynheer with the merry voice and the laughter-filled eyes who now looked so inexpressibly sad. Yet she had a message for him. Mynheer Cornelius Beresteyn, she said, desired to speak with him once more. The wench had murmured the words shyly, for her heart was aching for the handsome soldier and the tears were very near her eyes. But hearing the message he had jumped up with alacrity and was immediately ready to follow her. Mynheer Beresteyn had a room on the upper floor, she explained, as she led the way upstairs. The old man was standing on the narrow landing and as soon as Diogenes appeared upon the stairs, he said simply, "There was something I did forget to say to you downstairs. May I trouble you, sir, to come into my room for a moment?" He threw open one of the doors that gave on the landing and politely stood aside that his visitor might pass through. Diogenes entered the room, he heard the door being closed behind him, and thought that Mynheer Beresteyn had followed him in. The room was very dimly lighted by a couple of tallow candles that flickered in their sconces, and at first he could not see into the dark recesses of the room. But presently something moved, something ethereal and intangible, white and exquisite. It stirred from out the depths of the huge high-backed chair, and from out the gloom there came a little cry of surprise and of joy which was as the call of bird or angel. He did not dare to move, he scarcely dared to breathe. He looked round for Mynheer Beresteyn who had disappeared. Surely this could be only a dream. Nothing real on earth could be so exquisite as that subtle vision which he had of her now, sitting in the high-backed chair, leaning slightly forward toward him. Gradually his eyes became accustomed to the gloom. He could see her quite distinctly now, her fair curls round her perfect head, her red lips parted. Her eyes fixed upon him with a look which he dared not interpret. All around him was the silence and the darkness of the night, and he was alone with her just as he had been in this very room 5 days ago and then again at Rotterdam. "Saint Bavon, you rogue!" he murmured, "where are you? How dare you leave me in the lurch like this?" Then, how it all happened he could not himself have told you. He suddenly found himself at her feet, kneeling beside the high-backed chair. His arms were round her shoulders and he could feel the exquisite perfume of her breath upon his cheek. "Saint Bavon," he cried exultingly to himself, "go away, you rogue. There's no need for your admonitions now." Mynheer Beresteyn tiptoed quietly into the room. The roguish smile still played around his lips. He came up close to the high-backed chair and placed his hand upon his daughter's head. Diogenes looked up, and met the kindly eyes of the old man fixed with calm earnestness upon him. "Mynheer," he said, and laughter which contained a world of happiness as well as of joy danced and sparkled in every line of his face. Just now I refused 1/2 of your fortune. But 'tis your greatest treasure I claim from you now. Nay. You rascal, rejoined Beresteyn, as he lifted his daughter's chin gently with one finger and looked into her deep blue eyes which were brimful of happiness. Methinks that treasure is yours already. Go back, good Saint Bavon, cried the Laughing Cavalier in an ecstasy of joy, your heaven, you rogue, is not more perfect than this.